know you said I'm going to talk about multipliers, which I will, but I also wanted to do a little bit of just like what goes in our think tank when we're thinking about the influencers of how we manage when a breeding herd gets a wild type exposure. So there's a few topics I'm just going to try to approach and work through as we think about what are the influencers that we think about when we're looking at PRRS management decisions. And do I think this includes all of the things that go in our think tank? No, but just some things that I wanted to share with you guys today. So first, JQ and Cesar, I'm sorry. I'm going to tell you that strain dynamics do go into the play when we are making PRRS management decisions on a day-to-day basis. So you can slap my hand already to start that one. So yes, we are the producer that calls and says, hey, what is this virus doing for others? What is it doing for production? What's the abortion rate? What's the nursery impact going to be? Because as a production system, at some point, we've got to take those factors into play. But hopefully you guys will forgive me a little bit because there are other factors that come into play when that comes. So I'm going to look at you guys and hopefully you have some technology someday that helps us understand when we send in that processing fluid or that serum sample to help us better understand how to manage that in the process. But when we look at that think tank, strain dynamics do come into play in that decision-making process. Other things that we look at is, hey, what's happened history-wise within our system? So we've had some herds that have broke this year that when we do get a specific strain, we say, okay, what happened in our herds? Were those connected? Do those RFLP patterns match? What happened in this herd, and how do we want to manage it differently in this next herd that broke 4 weeks later because of some biosecurity breach that occurred? The other things we take into account are things that Daniel spoke about when it comes to our time to negative pig and baseline production, and what do those look like historically within our system and have looked like in the last few years or several years when we're taking that into account into making those decisions. What does our time to baseline production look like, and what does it look like for our system to manage it with herds taking longer and longer to eliminate the virus than they did several years ago? Another thing that we take into account when we're looking at what are we going to do with a PRRS management decision in our herd is time of year. So as a production company, things that are going to come into play when we're talking to our financial analysis team is going to be what's cull sow prices? What are the grade A futures of those wean pigs coming out of our herds going to be based on what time of year that the herds are breaking, so that we can make not only a production decision but an economic decision in how we're going to manage those closures within the system. So when we talk about the depop, repop, we've had a few more decisions on a depop this year specifically because we've had the advantage of the cull sow prices in the current market. Other things we look at, others have mentioned it relative to biosecurity when it's bioexclusion or biocontainment, and we look at area pressure. When a farm breaks with PRRS, what are the other herds, both our herds and other producers in the area's current status, or how are they managing it? So when we're making those decisions from a biocontainment perspective, if we have in our system a lot of pods of farms, so we have sow farms that are connected with others, whether it be through feed, transport, labor resources, supply delivery, you name it. So if we're going to choose between that depop, or repop, or an elimination, some of that biocontainment process decision comes into influencing how we're going to manage those closures or a depop decision, so that we can just get that virus, frankly, out of that pod of sow farms so that we don't have to worry about it. Other factors that come into it are pig flow. So we not only have sow farms, but we have a lot of wean to market sites that we work with from a production partner standpoint. And so where are we going to place those pigs? If that herd is a wean pig stable negative farm or a positive farm. And so when you take into the wean to market impact and the space allocations of it, we also consider that when we're thinking about how we're going to manage our PRRS decisions across the system as well. I'll touch base on the multiplication piece now for the last two bullet points here. So one of the things that we'll look at is our farms where we manage our own gilt sources and our own parent stock from a DN or a multiplier perspective. what happens when those farms break, and what happens when we can manage it, or when we have to get into utilizing other genetic sources outside of our multipliers, and what impact is that going to have on the short term and the long term for those closures. So if we have a multiplier that breaks, that drastically impacts not only the time of that closure, but then you have to wait all the weeks after it to raise that next parent stock gilt that's coming into it. So you got to add those extra weeks to grow the gilt after you break a multiplier, in addition to that time the negative pig timeline that you're looking at. As well as if we do break herds and we have to ask others for other parent stock gilts to come into our herds, what's that gilt source impact going to be for us when it comes to production? So if you have to mix gilt sources, what are their flu strains? What are their other endemic pathogen strains or bugs that are going to come into our herds and maybe have some production impacts? And then when we look at those decisions, also have several internal data pieces that we've looked at with what do those genetics do from a production standpoint, both on the feed conversion and on the sow farm production standpoint as well. One thing that's been unique, and I spoke about this a little bit at ASV, has been with just the changes and the resources that we've used relative to PRRS detection. Our ability to detect PRRS after an elimination process, specifically with the use of processing fluids within our system, has made looking at those multiplier herds unique and different. So I think Paul did a good job of kind of showing what that timeline looks like when you're processing fluids negative week after week after week after week. That's a great test for looking at those 3 to 7 day old piglets, but what about the wean pig? I know that BI has done some work with us on how do we get that 100% of the population test on wean pigs, and I think that this absolutely plays into an account when you're looking at a multiplication herd, because we don't have, in my opinion, great ability to look at what's the total population of those wean pigs coming out the door as you move PRRS virus potentially through the farrowing house. So when you have a multiplier sow farm that's broke with PRRS, what's your threshold or risk level of those wean pigs? If you get 12 weeks negative processing fluids out the door, would you capture that wean gilt, or are you going to be willing to take the risk on that wean gilt that there may have still been some PRRS circulating in that herd? We've had a couple of experience within our system that we would add additional weeks post those 12 to 16 weeks of negative processing fluids before we would feel comfortable capturing those animals after a multiplication break to go back into our commercial farms, because that original virus and those multipliers may still be lingering, and we just can't detect it on the wean pigs yet because we don't have the technology to look at 100% of those wean pigs today. With that, I want to thank you for the opportunity, and I think I was a little faster, but those are kind of some of the things that we take into account when we're looking at PRRS decisions within our breed wean herds.